Hello everyone and welcome back to another reaction video. Today we are taking a look at another part of the Unbiased History of Rome. This episode is titled Republican Deathrows. So without further ado, let's get going.
Nothing good ever lasts forever. It pains me to say, but the final days of the Roman Republic grow ever nearer. For you see, there is a specter haunting Rome. The specter of communism. Well, communism, barbarity, plebbery, many things to cover today. But before we get to it, we've got to return to those Greek wars that I skipped last time. So we're going back to the Second Punic War, our focus being the Greek kingdom of Macedonia, led by Philip V. He had allied himself with Carthage in the war, but was held back to a stalemate.
Yes, Philip V of Macedon tried to exploit the chaos of the Second Punic War by allying himself with Hannibal and Carthage. But in reality, the treaty signed between them didn't achieve anything of substance for either side, other than defining spheres of operation and interests. And Rome won this war by seeking assistance from Greek allies, such as the Aetolian League and the city-state of Pergamon and Rhodes.
Which is why I didn't bother to mention him before. He did begin to stir up some trouble after he saw Rome civilize some of his neighbors though. After attacking them, he was quickly defeated and pushed back, thus freeing the southern Greeks from his rule. Not that they were grateful, oh far from it. Sparta immediately revolted, only to be easily crushed. Oh, what was that? They were the best warriors of the Greek world? Well, that's kinda pathetic.
Yes, Sparta at this time had really declined, far from the days of Thermopylae, when their fighting force was quite revered in the Greek world. At this point, they are no match against Roman military power.
And here I thought that Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire was the hot shit.
Yes, the Seleucid Empire is interesting. The empire came about when the empire of Alexander the Great dissolved after his death, and basically one of his generals, Seleucus, known to history as Seleucus the First Nicator, managed to create an empire of his own from the ashes of Alexander's empire. And as you can see on the map here, it was quite large, quite powerful, and wealthy, and was only really challenged. In the west, they were challenged by Ptolemaic Egypt, and in the east, they were challenged by Chandragupta's Mauryan Empire. And yeah, it would remain quite a powerful empire right up until they came into contact with Rome, when their fortunes would change quite drastically.
I mean, just look at his empire.
Yes, and also they are led at this time by Antiochus III, who was quite ambitious, and he wanted to reclaim some of the territory that had been lost in Asia Minor and extend his power and influence into Greece, which meant they would inevitably butt head with the Romans, who also were claiming, who was also projecting power and influence into that region.
Look at those fucking borders. It is no surprise to me why Hannibal chose to join his court after he lost at Zama.
Yes, so Hannibal, after losing in the Second Punic War, proved to be quite an able statesman. He went on to serve Carthage as its chief magistrate, and he enacted some reforms to curtail the powers of the oligarchs, and he also began the arduous process of repaying Rome after they were levied with a massive war indemnity following the conclusion of the Second Punic War. Unfortunately for him, these reforms had made him an enemy to the oligarchic class even more than he had been before this, and combining this with Roman demands and claims that Hannibal was conspiring with the Seleucid Empire, Hannibal fled Carthage and went into exile at the court of Antiochus III.
Spending his remaining days convincing Antiochus to attack Rome, to liberate Greece. Those are some huge air quotes there. Antiochus was fucked twice in battle, once by LARPing as Leonidas in Thermopylae so hard that he lost the exact same.
Yes, in 191 BC, I believe, the Roman army under a consul Marcus Acilius Glabrio clashed with Antiochus III. Now, some context here. In 196 BC, the Seleucid Empire, or the Seleucids rather, had crossed the Hellespont and invaded Europe. They quickly gained a foothold there. Now, Rome demanded their withdrawal from Europe, of course, but they were rebuffed by the Seleucids, and there was quite some tension between these two powers until the Aetolian League, who had previously sided with Rome, convinced the Seleucids to attack Rome and liberate Greece, as they would say it. But yeah, this really brought the Seleucids into direct confrontation with the Romans, and the rival Achaean League sided with the Romans, as well as Philip V of Macedon, who had been thrashed in the Second Macedonian War at this point, and he was in no position to turn his back on Rome at this point. He was effectively a Roman vassal. But yes, in 191 BC, the first major clash of the war happened at the Thermopylae again. And what happened was basically that the Roman army tried to get through Antiochus III's main army, but the Romans outflanked his positions. Now, this outflanking detachment was led by none other than Cato the Elder, and yeah, they got their asses kicked.
Way, and then by getting completely annihilated in Magnesia by a Roman army half of his own size.
Yes, the second big battle of the Roman Seleucid War was the Battle of Magnesia, which pitted the forces of the Roman Republic, led by a certain Lucius Cornelius Scipio, the younger brother of Scipio Africanus, and he was supported by the Kingdom of Pergamon under Eumenes II, and they faced off against Antiochus III again. Now, when the battle happened, Eumenes managed to throw the Seleucid left flank into disarray. Even though the Seleucid had been able to gain some success on the right flank, the center of the Seleucid army was buckling, and the army sent to collapse before Antiochus could do anything about it. And that was the second great loss for the Seleucid Empire.
No less. All while Hannibal was losing twice at sea by the joint efforts of Scipio Africanus and his brother Scipio Asiaticus.
Ah, yes. After this campaign against the Seleucids, Scipio was granted the cognomen Asiaticus. So we have an Africanus and an Asiaticus. You could see a pattern here developing. Now, Hannibal, for reasons that are probably related to the fact that Antiochus didn't want to give Hannibal any sort of credit for any military victories, was held back, and he was instead given a task of building a navy. Now, Hannibal had not commanded any navies before, so it's a strange move, all things considered. But nonetheless, he took on this task and built the fleet from scratch. He faced off against the Rhodian navy, who was soundly defeated, and then the rest of the Seleucid navy was also defeated by a joint Roman-Rhodian fleet. And that was basically it for the Seleucid Empire. At this point, they had lost the war.
Utterly defeated, Antiochus fled east, losing Asia Minor to Rome's allies. You would think it would be enough, but then Macedon chimped out again, almost like they wanted to be balkanized into 4 vassal states.
Yes, the Seleucid provinces in Asia Minor was turned over to the Kingdom of Pergamon, and later on, 10 years after this perhaps, in 179 BC, Philip V of Macedon had died, and his ambitious son Perseus had succeeded to the throne. Now, Perseus was anti-Roman, and he helped stir up anti-Roman sentiments in Macedon, and the tensions escalated, and eventually Macedon went to war with Rome again, the Third Macedonian War at this point. And, after fighting to a standstill at the Battle of Callinicus in 171 BC, the Romans were finally able to defeat Perseus's forces at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, and this brought the war to a conclusion. And as a result, Macedon was divided into 4 client republics, all subservient to Rome, and the conclusion of this war greatly increased Roman prestige and authority in Greece.
Not that it was enough to pacify the region. Oh no, it took Metellus Macedonicus to achieve that, defeating and annexing Macedon once and for all.
Yes. Now, this happened in the so-called Fourth Macedonian War, fought from 150 to 148 BC, and it was fought against the Macedonian pretender to the throne. His name was Andriscius, I believe, and this action destabilized the situation, especially so since the Achaean League decided to join in on the action. And after all of the, of course, Rome soundly defeated all of these rebellions, and Roman military power had really been established at this point. And Rome decided that after a century of crisis management in Greece, they decided that it would be better if Greece was brought under the direct control of Rome. And that's what they did.
Some cities like Corinth tried to rebel after that, but they were all set ablaze for their trouble. Good riddance. Alright, back to addressing the Red Menace. As you know, whenever Rome conquered some barbarian rebel, they had the good sense to enslave and put them to work in their farms. This generated immense wealth to the patrician elite, making the plebeian masses super duper jelly, among them Tiberius and Gaius Gracchi, the grandsons of Scipio Africanus, if you can believe it.
Yes, and the Gracchi brothers would have an immense impact on the late Republican era. I'm sure he will go into why. But yes, as he mentioned, these are the grandsons of Scipio Africanus.
So what went wrong? Well, their father was a pleb, consul or not. That explains it. But how did it happen? Tiberius showed promise at first, fighting beside Scipio Aemilianus in Carthage and all, but once he was sent to serve in Hispania, he partook in a great defeat, personally signing a humiliating treaty for Rome to return home alive. His cowardice was quickly pointed out by the patricians, further fueling his resentment towards them, thus further leading him to the clutches of socialist ideology, getting elected as tribune of the plebs and proposing several socialist laws. Thankfully, they were all vetoed by a more enlightened tribune, whom he quickly had disposed of and harassed by his thugs.
Yes, so Tiberius Gracchus, his first political position was as quaestor, serving in Iberia, and there he saw the tremendous wealth disparity that was the case in the Roman Republic. Now, at this point, a very, very handful group of people, of wealthy landowners, owned the vast majority of lands throughout the Republic, and there was a great mass of landless poor, and he decided to do something about this. So he sought to relieve this by getting elected as tribune of the plebs, and he tried to push through a law that said that no person could own more than 125 acres of land, roughly, and that any excess land should be returned to the state and then redistributed to the people. The poor people, specifically. Now, as you can imagine, Rome's wealthy landowners, which were often senators, did not appreciate this idea, and they became very antagonistic toward Gracchus. Now, I think what we're going to talk about here is that when the king of Pergamon died in 133 BC, he bequeathed the entire kingdom to the people of Rome, and Tiberius tried to use this as an opportunity to redistribute these lands to the poor. And Well, the Senate did not take lightly to this, or kindly
And when the
rather.
king of Pergamon willed Rome to inherit his kingdom after his death, Tiberius had the gall to demand its lands to be given for free to the proletariat. For free, fucking commie. And it only got worse from here, as on the next year, while overseeing the voting process, Tiberius heard a fake rumor involving his assassination. Now scared for his life, Tiberius rose to the crowd, demanding them to give him a crown, so that, as king, he could crush the Roman Republic and bring forth the communist utopia. When the Senate heard of this treacherous shit, they immediately marched out with their weapons.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but what happened here is that Tiberius tried to seek re-election as tribune of the plebs, which was probably not allowed. But the Roman constitution was very flexible when it came to these matters, and in fact, he did get enough votes to get re-elected as tribune. However, this event led to a violent encounter with the Senate, and Tiberius himself was beaten to death, along with hundreds of his followers.
Ganging up on Tiberius and clubbing that filthy communist to death, later on throwing his corpse to the Tiber River along with his thugs. They later did the same with his brother Gaius, whom
Yes, Gaius Gracchus took up the reform cause of his brother about 10 years after, in 123 BC, and he actually successfully created a coalition of poor freemen and equestrians who were behind his ideals. And what happened was that around this time, the three main sources of Rome's grain supply, which was Sicily, Sardinia, and North Africa, were disrupted by locusts and droughts. And this caused some problems with the food supply, food prices skyrocketed, and as a result, the guys managed to enact a law that established state owned granaries, which would sell grain at a subsidized price to Rome's poorest citizens. And the so called grain dole was very effective in alleviating poverty, but it was not popular among the senators and the wealthy elite, as you can imagine, because this was quite an expensive program. And as a result, after one of Gaius's political opponents was killed, the Senate passed a decree that made it possible to execute anyone identified as an enemy of state without trial. Now, Gaius has thought that he would be targeted, and he was probably right. So, as a result, he committed suicide by falling on the sword of an enslaved person. And after Gaius's death, thousands of his supporters were arrested and summarily executed. And this really shows you how political violence had been normalized at this point in the Republic's history. That people could just get killed and that was it, for holding a political view that was not in line with the aristocracy. And here we see the divide between the so-called populares and optimates, which we will get into down the road.
also fell for the communist meme. I only feel sorry for Tiberius on this one though, he didn't deserve that. But say, now that the socialists are dead, let's talk about borders. As it was around this time that Rome struck a deal with Massalia to create the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul, connecting Italy with Hispania by a road through Narbonne. Quite convenient really, given how he was rebelling at the time. But don't worry, it was quickly pacified by Scipio Aemilianus himself, together with his subordinate, Tiberius Gracchi, back when he was still alive, as well as the Numidian Jugurtha and Gaius Marius.
Ah, yes. Jugurtha and Gaius Marius would become very important at the end of the 2nd century BC, right? The 100s, anyways. I always get that messed up. But yeah, we will talk about those soon enough.
Yeah, so more about this issue. After that, Jugurtha returned to Numidia, overthrowing his relatives in power and bribing all consuls that came to punish him.
Yes, so some more context is required here. Jugurtha was an experienced and skilled auxiliary commander in Roman service. He fought the various Iberian tribes, which were proving hard to suppress. And he was related to the ruling dynasty of the North African kingdom of Numidia. Now, following some internal strife, Jugurtha seized power in Numidia from his cousins. And of course, this was very worrying for Rome. They didn't want to destabilize Numidia, so they sent several diplomatic delegations to try to broker some kind of peace or compromise solution. And what Jugurtha basically did was bribe each and every one of these diplomatic delegations to get the most favorable peace terms possible. Now, eventually, some more internal strife continued to follow after this, whereupon the Rome actually sent an army, and at that point, Jugurtha faked his submission. And as a result, the Roman Senate invited him to Rome so he could testify and explain his actions, basically. And to get him to come, they offered him legal immunity. Now, while Jugurtha was in Rome, he actually had his nephew and rival claimant to the Numidian throne killed. And since he was under legal immunity, the Romans could do anything about it, so they had to let him go. Now, after he was let go, Rome finally decided that this man needed to be taken out and declared war on Jugurtha, which led to the so-called Jugurthine Wars. But yeah, and this is where Marius comes in to the picture.
To settle this, the Senate sent Metellus, the nephew of Macedonicus, to Numidia, accompanied by Gaius Marius, who was basically as good as a pleb could hope to become. Courageous, pragmatic, somewhat educated, reminds me of Servius Tullius.
Yes, Gaius Marius is one of the more famous statesmen and generals in Roman history, and he is, I would say, not as well known, of course, like Caesar and Pompeius, and I think he is overshadowed a bit by those two characters since he's relatively close in time.
Being too much of a bitch to face Metellus and Marius face to face, Jugurtha started employing every guerrilla trick in the book to delay defeat. So much so that Marius had the time to return Rome, get elected consul, and take over command of the war, bringing with him his subordinate Lucius Sulla. And gods, I love this guy. He soon proved himself capable by persuading Bocchus, the king of Mauritania, to betray Jugurtha, giving him.
Yes, so what happened is that Marius took command, he got elected to the consulship, took command, he promised to end the war swiftly, and it proved to be harder than he thought, but eventually he managed to drive Jugurtha into the neighboring kingdom of Mauritania. Now, Mauritania was ruled by a man named Bocchus, and what happened was that Marius, through his lieutenant, Sulla, managed to strike a deal with Bocchus that would see him, Jugurtha, handed over to Rome, and that's what happened. Now, this would cause some problems for Rome later down the line, because Marius claimed the credit, even though it was Sulla who had engineered this deal. And according to Roman tradition, credit rightfully belongs to Marius because he was the commanding officer, and Sulla was just a subordinate, and therefore inflaming tensions between the two men, and this would have severe consequences for the Republic.
To Sulla, whom then gave him to Marius, who then took all the credit for it. Yep, Sulla and Marius became bitter rivals after that, likely on top of their factional differences. These are the good guys, by the way, if you couldn't figure out by the name. But you know what? Forget all that, for neither Numidians nor plebs can compare to the threat that's about to come. An enemy so evil, full of malevolence and hatred, that not only do they wish to spread chaos, but to destroy existence itself. The greatest enemies of mankind,
The Germans?
and worst barbarian race of all. Germans.
The
Two of
Germans.
their tribes, the Cimri and the
course.
Teutones, had migrated south from the lands of eternal chaos,
The
destroying
lands of
everything in their
eternal
path
chaos.
until they neared Italy. Marius could tell that this was no ordinary foe, and so issued the Marian reforms, creating the Roman legion of popular imagination.
Yep.
There were no more hastati, principes, or triarii.
He's gonna go through what the reforms were. However, I should say that there is some dispute as to whether Marius rightfully deserves the credit for the so-called Marian reforms. Some think it was more a thing that was on its way, it was already happening, and Marius doesn't really deserve the credit for inventing this new Roman military organization. But let's hear what he has to say here.
just legionaries, and 2 assistants for every 8 of them, which made up the contubernium, led by a decanus. 10 of those made a sentry, led by a centurion. 6 of those made up a cohort, led by an experienced centurion, and 9 of those, plus a special first cohort led by the primus pilus, together made up the Roman legion. There was some cavalry, but who gives a shit about them? The legion was led by a legate, an elected senator, advised by his useless military tribunes, with the supplies and constructions led by the camp prefect. Overall, the reforms allowed any poor fact to enlist, made the generals responsible for their payment, and transformed the legions into stronger, faster, cheaper, professional soldiers, with no downsides at all.
Yes. There were a lot of benefits to these reforms, and all of them are listed there, so I don't need to repeat them. Downsides, well, militarily there wasn't perhaps any great downsides, though socially this would have immense consequences for the Republic. This is actually what I would say is one of the main contributing factors to the downfall of the Republic.
Nope. It was with this army that both Marius and Sulla confronted the Germs, annihilating both the Cimbri and the Teutonic tribes, despite being heavily outnumbered. But Marius would remain forever scarred, as the
Yes, Marius and Sulla successfully waged a campaign against these Germans, the so-called Cimbrian Wars. And Marius got elected consul several times during this period, and I believe he's like on his 5th consulship, which is wholly unprecedented, I should say. I'm not sure about that, but he was elected consul 7 times, that I know.
horrors he experienced by facing the Germs in battle could never be remedied, with Sulla sharing the sentiment. But at least Rome had been saved from a Germanic sack, for now. And if it all sounded too easy for you, that won't be the last time we hear from those germs. I wish.
Yep.
I really do. Anyway, let's talk about that civil war that's going on in Italy right now. You know, the social war, when the Italians decided to collectively revolt, again,
Yes, the social war is very interesting. It's still not entirely clear why the Italian allies were revolting. There are 2 threads in the ancient accounts. One is basically saying it was a struggle for Roman citizenship. The other one portrays it as a struggle against Roman hegemony and domination. Now, what basically happened here was that the Romans, to tamp down on this revolt, proposed a law called Lex Julia, which would give citizenship to those who had not revolted or to those who decided to lay down their arms. And this, combined with Sulla's campaign in the south of Italy, put an end to the social war pretty quickly. But the result was the same nonetheless, that the Italian allies were finally granted citizenship, which had been a long time coming, and they deserved it, I must say.
Founding a new capital, printing coins that mocked Rome, getting absolutely trashed by Sulla in Asculum and Nola, and, well, I guess that's that. Sulla really hated Samnites, by the way. Well, who doesn't? As the war neared its end, Rome offered citizenship to those who surrendered, as a sign of goodwill. Let's see how long it will take for the Samnites to chimp out again. Spoiler warning, not even 5 minutes. Now a famous war hero, Sulla would get himself elected as consul, which happened to coincide with yet another Greek king starting shit in the east. So let's get back to that particular rabbit hole again. So we have this kingdom called Pontus, right? It was ruled by a guy named Mithridates, a vicious Greekoid. He began
Yes, Mithridates the Sixth. He was a very effective, ambitious, a ruthless ruler. He sought to dominate Asia Minor and the Black Sea region, and he waged several hard-fought wars against the Romans, but ultimately he was unsuccessful to break the Roman domination over the Hellenistic world, as we would call it. And despite this, he is considered the greatest ruler of the Kingdom of Pontus, but he's more famous for the fact that he cultivated immunity to many poisons by regularly ingesting sublethal doses of it. And this practice is actually called Mithridatism today, which was a curious thing about Mithridates, the fact that he wanted to have these immunities poisoned.
Both plotting and directly fighting against all of his neighbors, especially Rome's client states like Bithynia. Rome tried to raise some local auxiliaries to stop him, but they were too weak. And after having taken control of all of Asia Minor, and I swear I'm not exaggerating, Mithridates ordered the genocide of every Roman man, woman, and child in Asia. 100,000 Roman colonists were mercilessly killed and sacrificed to Moloch.
He's actually not exaggerating. This is exactly what Mithridates did. I'm not sure about the exact numbers though, but he did order the killing of the Roman citizens living in Asia Minor. So yeah, that happened.
In the most despicable act ever committed by a Greek since the sack of Troy. Needless to say that Sulla was horrified when he learned of this, preparing his legions for a campaign to avenge the fallen. But this is where Marius finally goes truly mad. He was quite old by then, you see, and combined with his PTSD and plebeian nature, he went full senile, demanding that the Senate transfer Sulla's army leadership to him, which they actually did.
Yep.
Why? Well, this is the kind of shit you get when you allow plebs to have political rights. I fucking told you, I fucking did. And honestly, it was too much for Sulla to take. Between being betrayed by an increasingly plebeian-dominated Senate and the sheer evil of both Greeks and Germs, Sulla forced himself to swallow that bitter red pill. The truth was that the Jews were behind everything. oh no, wait, wrong red pill.
Wrong red pill.
Yes, here. Alright, so the truth was that the Republic would soon fall if things kept going the way they were. With this in mind, Sulla, the madman, did the unthinkable, ordering his legions to march to Rome, for he would personally save the Republic, by force. Marius might have become senile by then, but he wasn't stupid, fleeing to Africa just before Sulla could arrive. He chose to be lenient, quickly lecturing the Senate, and after having restored order, Sulla returned to his invasion plans, crossing the sea and proceeding to crush Mithridates' armies twice in the battles of Chaeronea and Archimedes, and then setting Athens ablaze after that. Because fuck Greeks, seriously man. With his armies destroyed, Mithridates surrendered, renouncing all of his conquests in Asia. It was only to buy time though. Once a barbarian, always a barbarian. But once a pleb, always a pleb too. For Marius used this time to raise his own legions on Africa, marching on Rome and killing every optimates he could find, forcing the Senate to elect Cinna and himself consuls, for the 7th time, only for him to die like 3 weeks later. So much for that. Cinna would later be killed by his troops to try and curry favor with Sulla, which just didn't work. He was too pissed for that. What happens later is just hilarious. The Senate appointed a total of 4 consuls to try and stop Sulla. The first was Asiaticus' son, whose army defected him. The second was Norbanus, whom only raised recruits, against Sulla's veteran armies. Very shitty plan. And the last 2 were Carbo and Marius' son, whom Sulla would defeat easily with the help from his 2 supporters, Pompey and Crassus.
Here we can see the effects of the rivalry between Sulla and Marius. It resulted in a de facto civil war where control of the city of Rome was contested several times between Marius and Sulla. This led to some unfortunate precedents being set. The precedent that has been set by Sulla is that he marched on the city of Rome and he proved that this could be done. This had not been done by Romans before, and therefore he inspired others later down the line, many people later down the line, to attempt to do this also, to seize power and so on. And this was another step in the Republic's decline, and Sulla tried his best to frame a settlement whereby the army would remain loyal to the Senate rather than the generals such as himself, and he attempted to mitigate this by passing some laws that limited the actions of generals in provinces. However, these reforms did not prevent ambitious men such as Pompey and Caesar from following in his footsteps. And he also set the precedent of performing proscriptions, which was basically a state-sanctioned hit list of political enemies that were to be killed and their assets seized by the state. So Sulla set some really terrible precedent for the Republic, and by that point, at this point, it's inevitable that the Republic cannot last. And Pompey and Crassus, seen on screen, would be key contributors to the downfall of the Republic.
Ah man, the next episode is gonna be so fucking fun to edit. To top it all off, 20,000 Samnites showed up as a final opposition to Sulla, whom he happily had all killed. Kind of pointless, really. Appointing himself dictator for life, Sulla issued the proscriptions, putting bounties on the heads of every filthy popularis he took a dislike to, thus purging the Senate, Rome, and abroad of their ilk, later on passing a series of laws to prevent any future wannabe Mariuses from harming the Republic. And finally, after hearing that Mithridates was starting shit once again, he had his general in the field sue for peace after a quick skirmish, just to let that Greekoid fuck off to the east and be somebody else's problem. Now finished with his duties, Sulla resigned his lifelong dictatorship after just 1 year, serving as consul for a little bit, and then retiring to his small farm with his wife, and his Greek twink sex slave of course, whom he fucked every single day and night of his retirement. Because if he was too old to fuck Greeks on the battlefield, he would do it in his bed, for there is nothing manlier than asserting your authority over a weaker man's ass while your wife cooks food for you. And that's all for today. A series of wars and internal conflicts
Classic
that brought the
Dovahhatty moment
Republic
right
to the
there.
brink, only to be saved by the righteous hand of conservative patrician Optimates Justice. And well, I'm lying. There is one more scene I should return to. It was during the funeral of Gaius Marius' wife, Julia, as her nephew rose up from the crowd and had this to say about her.
The nephew in question is none other than Gaius Julius Caesar.
The family of my Aunt Julia is descended by her mother from the kings, and on her father's side is akin to the immortal gods. For the Marquis Rages go back to Ancus Marcius and the Julii, the family of which ours is a branch, to Venus. Our stock, therefore, has at once the sanctity of kings, whose power is supreme among mortal men, and the claim to reverence which attaches to the gods who hold sway over kings themselves.
Alright, that was a great setup to the next episode, which is about the first triumvirate, and finally we are getting to the period of Roman history that most people know about, the period of Julius Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey the Great. So with that, I'll see you guys next time, and take care. Bye.